Good evening. It's good to be here. I've come recently. I was in Canada recently on my way to here, so I have a tiger story. It seems that two fellows were in the jungles of Canada, running around, and they ran into a huge tiger, just a couple of hundred yards from where they were standing, and they both were quite scared, and they both froze. And one of them just slowly and carefully began to take off his pack, let it down, open it up, and he pulled out a pair of running shoes. And very slowly and carefully started to slip off his shoes and put on the running shoes. Meanwhile, his terrified buddy's looking at him and says, "What are you doing all that for? You're not going to be able to outrun the tiger." To which he replied, "Yes, that's true, but I'll be able to outrun you." There's probably a moral in that somewhere. In 1837, the legislature of the state of Pennsylvania declared, "A corporation in law is just what the Incorporation Act makes it. It is the creature of the law and may be molded to any shape or for any purpose that the legislature may deem most conducive for the general good." And that pretty much reflected both the law and the culture in the states at that time. But a lot of things have been happening lately, which makes one wonder how that could have been true. For example, we see lots of mergers and acquisitions, giant corporations coming together, becoming more giant corporations. It doesn't matter what the industry is, whether it's telecommunications or media or pharmaceuticals or healthcare. And so right now we have our three principal TV networks are owned by two nuclear companies and a cartoon company. So it doesn't seem to be necessarily a relationship between the company that owns the company and what each of them do. In Vermont, about a year ago, the Vermont legislature passed a law, and the governor signed it, which said that any product made with recombinant BGH, the bovine growth hormone, had to be labeled. Shortly thereafter, a couple of front corporations of corporations, the Ice Cream Manufacturers Association, the Grocery Store Owners Association, the Dairy Farmers Association, front corporations of the real corporations, with the Monsanto Corporation only as a friend of the court, the manufacturer of the hormone, appealed to the courts in Vermont to declare this law unconstitutional because it was an invasion of the free speech of these corporations. There is a doctrine now called negative free speech, that a corporation can't be compelled to say things about itself that it doesn't want to say. Now the state appeals court, the state courts turned down that petition. So they went to the federal courts, and in September of 1996, a federal court, three-judge panel, considered the case and decided that, yes, if this case came to the Supreme Court, it would be likely that they would declare this law unconstitutional as an invasion of the First Amendment rights of these corporations, and therefore called upon the judiciary of the state of Vermont to suspend the law until the Supreme Court, or until the Supreme Court hears the case. At the ministers' meeting of the World Trade Organization in December in Singapore, one of the many subjects that was under discussion was opening up all government procurement at every level, local, municipal, state, federal, in every country around the world, to the lowest bidder of any corporation anywhere. Essentially removing whatever rules that a municipality or a state has regarding setting up criteria, conditions for letting contracts. We're talking about literally trillions of dollars. You're talking about all the government spending in the world. On last November's ballot, in a couple of states, there were some versions of campaign finance reform initiatives. And one of the most prominent ones was in Maine, which essentially was a fairly limited, extremely limited bill. But it did begin to talk about restricting the contributions of corporations. There was no opposition to this initiative except from one organization, the American Civil Liberties Union, which takes the position that any infringement upon free speech is counter to the idea of the First Amendment, including corporate free speech. So I'm sure I can make a list, and you all can make a list of many examples where it appears as if corporations have certain powers and privileges and rights under law that don't seem to be consistent with common sense, and that enable them, in fact, to exert power and authority over the culture, over our democratic processes, over how we think. The program on corporations, law, and democracy over the last 4 or 5 years has been bringing people together to talk about this stuff. We've been trying to have democratic conversations, listening to each other and ourselves rather than to the instruments of the dominant culture. Engaging each other, sort of asking what's going on, how do we get to this place? How do we get to this place where property, which is really what a corporation is, an agglomeration of property, has the same rights as human beings. And because it's an agglomeration of property and wealth, it is therefore more powerful than human beings. How did this happen? So we've been trying to sort of figure out our side of the story, not the corporate story, not the story of the dominant in history, but our story of how we got to this place. And we've been piecing it together. It's sort of like a tapestry. It's not necessarily chronological, and it has a lot of weavings, a lot of different strands and threads weaving in and out. And I'm going to try tonight to talk to you about our story in terms of where we are today. The fascinating thing about this process has been that as different people come in with different histories and different perspectives, the story changes. I mean, they bring in their perspective, and the whole story changes. And it makes it clearer, easier for us to see different connections. And I'm hoping to engage all of you in this story so that you will bring in your perspectives and your histories and the histories that you know into this story, so that finally at some point, maybe in some years, we'll have a very clear, many people, a critical mass of people, will have a very clear sense of how we got to this place. And it'll be our story and not the story of the General Electric Corporation or the Westinghouse Corporation or the Bank of America Corporation. One of the hard things about developing our story is to know where to begin. You know, we can begin at World War II, we can begin at the Civil War, we can begin at the American Revolution, we can begin in the 15th century, we can go back to the Greeks and the Romans. You can go back to sort of the beginning of time when people started coming together to resist, to form entities, to form governments or whatever, to resist tyranny. It all seems to be, all of history has been about humans trying to tyrannize other humans and humans trying to organize to resist the tyranny of other humans. So I'm not going to go back all the way tonight. I'm going to start basically with the 15th century. A big change, a lot of big changes, I guess, happened in the 15th century. One of the big changes, well, two of the big things that happened towards the end of the century, as you know, from Western Europe, the explorers went out and started making their ways around the world. Columbus, of course, in 1492, Vasco da Gama circumnavigated the globe, I think, in 1498. There was strong central governments in Eastern Europe and in Europe, and there was interest in exploration and riches and wealth and power and tyranny. And one of the changes that took place sort of psychologically was the change in viewing business and money and well, particularly usury. That something had to happen, sort of a precursor to a commercial era, needed to happen to remove the sanctions on charging interest on usury. I mean, it really was the cultures, law and cultures did not look kindly on charging interest, making money from money, and on centering your life on raising huge amounts of wealth. And the Puritans and the Calvinists seem to have changed that. And a way to express yourself, to express your spirituality through business became quite acceptable. And that really helped open the door psychologically to the rise of the great merchant corporations. So that the giant global corporations that we have today are not particularly anything new. That starting in the mid-16th century, we had the rise of the global corporations of that era. From England alone, these chartered corporations, chartered by the Crown, these subordinate artificial entities created by the Crown. 1553, the Russia Company. 1553, the Africa Company, chartered to make huge profits in the slave trade. 1577, the Spanish Company to open up, to trade with Spain and Portugal. 1578, the Eastland Corporation to open up Scandinavia. 1582, the Levant Company to open up Turkey. In 1588-89, the precursor to the East India Company was created, the Governor's Company and merchants and venturers trading with the East Indies Company. 1592, the Venice Company. 1600, the East India Company formally was created. In 1605, King James I gave it a charter in perpetuity. Now, what were these entities? What was their nature? Well, first of all, they were chartered monopolies, chartered by a monarch who law and culture regarded as sovereign. He was the sovereign. As the sovereign, what was his main job? His main job was to define people and things. Define them either as property, as subjects, as non-existent, or whatever. He was the sovereign. He had all power. He created these companies to help him raise money, to help expand the length and breadth of his control. They got monopoly gifts to trade routes, monopoly in terms of the nature of the products. They got the power to make laws. They had the power to impose fines and punish people. They had the power to imprison. They had power to draft people into the army, to tell people what to grow, what to make. They were literally, as Thomas Hobbes called them, chips off the old block of sovereignty. They were a chip of sovereignty. And the sovereignty came from the king. It's no great mystery what they were about. The directors of the East India Company in 1687 sent a message to their people in India to establish a polity of civil and military power. They were governing bodies. I think that's a very important principle, that the nature of these corporations from the beginning was that they were governing bodies. To limit, and their job was to limit competition, to have exclusive monopoly privilege, to buy cheap, to sell dear, control the settling of disputes. They were acting as sovereigns and they were going to govern. In India, fairly sophisticated, very sophisticated, the subcontinent of India was quite a sophisticated place. The job of the East India Company was to destroy the culture and destroy the memory of the culture, to destroy the mechanisms of commerce and industry and trade, to create dependence, to take over the political government, and then to vacuum out the resources. And over the course of the next 250 years, that's what they did. So you had an India of when the British came, when the East India Company came, was an exporter of both food and cotton cloth. 200 years later, they were importers of both. And you probably know the history of how that came about. Now, the East India Company, as well as the other companies, they had their propaganda their PR corporations and their propaganda machines. And they had people writing their histories. And that propaganda and that history was very much in the language that we would recognize today. That it's in the language of, I guess the best way to sum it up is, we're doing it all for you. Right? That what's good for the East India Company is good for all the people of India, and certainly good for the British Empire. So the corporations always were able to use the language that was hot and the concepts that was hot to say that we're doing it all for you. Now, one of the problems with these companies, this delicate relationship between the sovereign and the companies, was the sovereign wanted these companies to succeed. He gave them a chip of his sovereign power so that they could throw people in jail and raise armies and do all these things and bring back great wealth. But he didn't want them to get too powerful, because then they could turn on him. So how did he keep them in their place? Well, first of all, a king or queen, when they grow up, they're taught from the very early age how to act like a sovereign. Right? There's no baloney about that. They're not taught to act like consumers. They're not taught to act like workers. You know, they're not taught to act like stakeholders. They're taught to act like the sovereigns that they are. So when a king, historically, going back to 500 years before that, when a king in England felt that a magistrate that he had appointed was doing things that were inappropriate, there was a mechanism for that. It was called a quo warranto proceedings, simply Latin for by what authority. He would summon the magistrate, you know, and not get into a whole bunch of details of all the little things the magistrate has been doing, but essentially ask the question, by what authority have you subordinate entity that I appointed, I the sovereign appointed, by what authority have you been doing all this stuff? And if the king had judged that in fact the magistrate had been exceeding his authority, he was removed. The same with the corporation. And in fact, the kings revoked the charters of a number of these corporations. The king would summon the corporation and ask, not how many parts per million of this toxic were you throwing out over the course of this year, not how many legislators did you bribe last week, not how did you manipulate the defining of issues in the popular culture, but he looked at the sort of totality of actions that the corporation had been engaged in and said, this is adding up to an assault upon my sovereignty. By what authority are you, the subordinate entity, assaulting the authority of the sovereign? And if it was a judge, if he judged that in fact the corporation was assaulting the authority of the sovereign, then he dissolved the corporation, revoked the charter, dissolved the corporation. The assets were distributed among the shareholders, and that was it. And so it was very much a self-protection mechanism to protect the sovereign. And I would say that if there was ability to communicate, kings all over the world, whenever a king brought a corporation up at a quo warranto, all the other kings were probably looking for this king to be socially responsible to these other kings, and not to allow a subordinate entity to get out of hand so much as to possibly overthrow the king. So that, you know, that's sort of the principle going back 1,000 years in English common law in which we share in this country. Now in the New World, the so-called New World, the crown corporations were in fact the principal mechanism of colonization and settlement and destruction of the New World. I'm from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. That was originally several companies, the Plymouth Company, the Massachusetts Bay Company. In Virginia, you had the London Company and then the Virginia Company. In the Carolinas, you had the Carolina Company, whose charters were written by none other than John Locke, who was experienced at writing ship's charters and moved from there to writing the charters for these crown corporations. Same difference. They were hierarchical, dictatorial corporations, chartered by the king, by the sovereign, just like the East India Company. You have the Hudson's Bay Company, you have others in this country as well. Now, so those were all chartered in the 17th century. We had a couple of hundred years between that and the American Revolution. It took a couple of hundred years for the colonists to sort of figure out what was going on, to figure out that they didn't have to be ruled absentee by these absentee entities where they had no legal standing, where in fact the governors, through the king, determined who was a person, who was not a person, who was property, what was property, who could grow this, who had to do that. And there were lots of experiments with electing legislatures and trying to spread some power around. But as we got into the 1860s and 1870s, there was a growing movement, in fact, to end this association with England and to do something about these crown corporations which were running people's lives. Now, there were probably people, obviously, there were people at the time who said, well, let's negotiate with the king. Let's get the king to act in a more socially responsible way. Let's get the parliament to be more accountable. You know, maybe we can get them to sign a voluntary code of conduct. You know, and they'll be and promise it to be a little less bad, a little less harsh, to give us a few rights. And then up popped Tom Paine. You go back and read Common Sense. It's really a very single-focused, beautifully written piece that sets out to destroy the concept of the English monarchy, to take its legitimacy, to just pull the rug out from its legitimacy. Talk about a bunch of ruffians that came over from France, you know, fought their way into power, took over, created the whole story, made them themselves king and sovereign. So that they didn't come from God, they didn't come from Mother Nature. And eventually there was a revolution. Now, I think it's very important to point out what the revolution was and what the revolution was not. And I think it was a couple of very, very important things. First, by force of arms, it took this sovereignty from the king and vested it in the people. Not in the states, not in the federal government, but in the people. Very important. Different. I was just in Canada. They didn't have that revolution. So the crown is still sovereign in Canada. And so they have a different twist on their story there. And they transformed these private corporations into constitutionalized states. So that the Virginia Corporation became the Commonwealth of Virginia with a constitution, tripartite form of government, elections, terms of office, due process, a judicial system, where people, which we'll get to in a moment, if they were people, had certain legal standing. And that all power had to be answerable. All power came from the people. Go back and look at all the early state constitutions. The very first line is that all power is vested in the people. It's still probably a relic in some of our constitutions. So that was very clear, that they transformed these private corporations into public constitutionalized entities. Second, they sent packing the concept of monarchy. Right? They said, we're not going to, as I said before, negotiate with the monarch. We're going to govern ourselves, a new concept that took hundreds of years to sort of evolve. We're going to govern ourselves. We're going to be accountable to one another. We're going to define ourselves. Instead of having the king or some absentee, faraway monarch define us, we, the people, are going to define ourselves. We're going to define our relationships with one another, our relationships with investment, with work, with the natural world. We're going to define all this. But there was a fatal problem, a fundamental structural defect. And that is a minority of people at the time of these colonists were strong enough and organized enough to define the majority of humans as non-persons or as property. So that most of the human beings in the 13 colonies at the time of the Revolution, African Americans, Native people, women, white men without property, debtors, indentured servants, were defined as either property or non-persons. So that sovereignty in this country was I can't even use the word flawed. It was screwed up fatally from the very start, with ramifications throughout our entire history down to today. So it was not a democracy except for a minority of people. And the seeds were sown so that, in fact, when the creations, the institutional creations of the people, started to try to rise up, that they had naturally a division of the rest of the people. That you didn't have a unified body of humans that were the sovereign people, because you had whole classes of people who had to spend the next couple hundred years becoming persons, getting there, struggling, organizing for their civil rights and their political rights, not just under law, but throughout the culture. Just as today, gays and lesbians, immigrants, people still don't have all their rights, still are not defining themselves, both in law and in culture. Then, sort of along with that, there are three themes that I think that go through our history that are very important to follow, that also are threads that weave in and out, which sort of I've alluded to. One is the whole question of who is a person. What's personhood? Who's a person? Who defines who? Throughout our history, that's been a very important issue. Second is what's public and what's private, both in terms of tangible things like property and in terms of decision making. One of the things that happens when you transform a private corporation into a constitutionalized state is that you're taking what had been in the realm of private decision making and making it public decision making. I mean, that's one of the great achievements of this country, to take what had been, to say we're going to take what had been the private decisions of a monarch or his direct appointees and make these public decision making, and then create the mechanisms to do that. The same with property. There's always been a struggle of, what's the commons and what's private. And we see that today with all the, what had been the commons being privatized, essentially by corporations. The third was, what is violence? Or maybe more carefully put, what is legal? When is violence legal? When can the state or other entities use violence and it's okay? So for example, given the right conditions, when there's a strike, it's okay to call out the militia and use violence against striking workers. It's okay to bomb another country. I mean, these are legalized violence. Whereas when a corporation pours out what's known as a toxic chemical in the millions of pounds, killing people, that's not considered violence. So that's a definitional question, right? And who decides these definitional questions? Well, if the process is public, then the public is deciding the definitional questions of what's legal violence and what's illegal violence. Just like it's deciding who's a person and who's not a person, or whether a tree has standing. Those are all definitional questions, relational questions. And if they're public, it's a very different process from if it's private. If the decisions are made just in a corporate boardroom, those are private. If it's made in the open, in elections and public with lawmaking by people elected by us, then it's public. So, all right, despite the fundamental structural problems with sovereignty, one of the things that the people who were in charge in those early generations, up to the Civil War, one of the things they were very clear about was the role and nature of corporations. They had had ample experience with these corporations, firsthand, and also had heard all about them. And they knew their nature. They knew that their nature was to control, to get political power, to limit competition, to rise up against their creator and recreate the conditions of their own existence. And so for this first several generations after the Constitution was ratified, both the law and the culture reflected processes, procedures, mechanisms to define the corporation in very, very precise and narrow ways, to limit their ability to rise up. You go back and look at the early charters which were given by the states. They're very, very precise. You can have a charter. People come to the legislature and ask for a charter to build a road, to build a highway, to build a canal, to make a certain product. And the charter is, after deliberation, the charter is given, and then basically these requests come one at a time. The charter is given for that particular task. You want a charter to build a highway? You get a charter to build a highway, not for any lawful purpose, like today. You can have the charter for 10 or 15 years. The amount of years is specified. The amount of capital is specified, the maximum. The amount of property you can hold, and it only has to be related to the task, is specified. Corporation couldn't own another corporation. The relationship between the shareholders and the directors was outlined with special preference for protecting the rights of minority directors. All the directors and managers were liable for all harms and debts. There wasn't a shield against liability. You can go back and look at the charters in all the states that were states then, and the states that then came into the Union. And then in the general incorporation laws that started to come in before the Civil War, starting in some states and spreading around. The same kinds of limitations. The charters and the corporation codes were used to define the corporation in very, very specific terms. And the states reserved the right to amend the charter or to revoke the charter. And to revoke, not even for cause, to revoke simply because on principle the corporation was a subordinate entity and we were the sovereign people. And you don't need a reason, if you're the sovereign people, to revoke the charter of a corporation. And one of the mechanisms that they used, surprise, surprise, was the quo warranto, going back into English common law. The tool of the sovereign to summon the corporation and say, by what authority have you done this? We didn't give you authority to do that. Where did you get the authority to do this and that? And then to revoke the charter if it was adjudged that in fact the corporation had exceeded its authority. It's the relationship that's essential here. And the nature of the corporation being a subordinate entity, and the nature of the people being the sovereign people. That's important here. And as I've thought about this, actually over the last couple of years, last year really, I've begun to see that the revocation of a corporate charter is not really like a punishment. In fact, it has very little to do with the corporation itself. If I can use an analogy, if somebody has a cancer and the surgeon comes in and cuts the cancer out, it's not to punish the cancer. It's to protect the body, right? Same thing. The corporation becomes a cancer on the body politic. It becomes an assault upon our ability to govern ourselves, an assault upon our ability to function democratically, because it's this concentration of private power. And then it begins to use this private power, just like all the crown corporations of the 17th and 18th century did, not just to do commerce, but to affect the politics, to shape the society, to define people, to wield the powers of sovereignty, to become the governing force. In the theory of the United States, a corporation cannot exercise the authority and the power of governance. It's not a sovereign entity. It's a creation of the state. So in fact, it's we the people being socially responsible to each other and being accountable to the generations who struggled before us and to our posterity and to the earth. If we're going to be accountable, it's our job to prevent unconstitutionalized power, private power, from rising up within us and overcoming us and affecting our ability to govern ourselves, to be the sovereign people, to act like sovereign people. So it's our responsibility to one another. That's really the important thing here. Now, with the Civil War and the coming of the Industrial Revolution, you had a whole new slew of powerful corporations rising up despite these efforts. Railroad corporations, banking corporations, land corporations, insurance, grain, manufacturing corporations after the Civil War, mostly enriched by government spending during the war, as wars do. And the people running them began to realize that this whole mechanism, this whole system of chartering and quo warranto and the relationship between the sovereign people and the subordinate entity of the corporation wasn't any good, not for what they wanted to do. And so starting in the late 1860s, early 1870s, they set out to transform the law and the culture regarding all this stuff. And over the course of the next 40 years or so, they did. And essentially what they did was, using mostly the federal courts, or the federal courts, mostly the Supreme Court being the mechanism, got themselves declared persons, legal persons, in 1886. So the rights got the rights of persons, and then slowly started to expand the civil rights of persons. In 1886, remember, that's prior to African Americans de facto having the rights of persons. Prior to women didn't get the rights of votes till 1920. Prior to Native peoples. So corporations became persons before the majority of natural human beings. Right? Second, they had to transform the property rights. This whole question of what's a public decision and what's a private decision. And using the 14th Amendment. Some people call it an irony. It's worse than an irony. The 14th Amendment was passed after the Civil War to protect the rights of freed slaves. So no state shall take the property, shall harm, I forget the exact language. No state shall take the property of any person without due process of law. It required equal protection of the law. And what the corporation set out to do was to get the protections of due process and equal protection applied to them. And the courts started to agree with that and started to apply that protection. So essentially, when the due process clause was in there, and it's also in the Fifth Amendment, to protect natural people from tyrannical power, from our own government. And it was turned on its head so that the due process clause and the equal protection clause was used to protect the corporation, the subordinate entity, from the sovereign people. So that as people started passing, as the corporation started to get bigger and more powerful, people in the state started to organize and started to enact laws to further define the corporation, to limit the ability of state legislatures to charter certain kinds of corporations, to give the sovereign power away. An example of the law, I don't think you'll find it so radical. In Pennsylvania, for example, municipalities in the state passed laws to say that when a coal miner comes up with his coal, that it had to be weighed by an impartial body, not by the company. And that the miner had to be paid in currency, not in company scrip. Not the two most radical concepts in the world. Well, the Supreme Court declared those unconstitutional as a taking of the corporate property without due process. So between 1880 and 1920 or so, hundreds and hundreds of state laws were declared unconstitutional because they were invasions of the property rights of corporations. So essentially you had the creation of something that we call today the market. You know, that most stuff having to do with investment, production, the organization of work, and commerce, over the course of these 40 years, was essentially declared beyond the authority of the sovereign people. It was like a whole new category. This is the market. This is commerce. This is investment. And when the courts got done with it, we the people, had no authority in this realm. So you see that today, for example, employees on company property don't have First Amendment rights, don't have free speech, don't have free assembly. Corporation has free speech. We saw that in the Vermont case. So the corporation has First Amendment rights, but workers on company property don't have First Amendment rights. We all take for granted in some sense that somehow we have no authority, even though we're the sovereign people. If we ever stop to think about what it means to be the sovereign people, we have no authority over the investment that a corporation makes, over the nature of the production, who decide what product it decides to make, technologies it uses. These are all managerial prerogative. These are doctrines given, concocted, propounded by the courts. This is not a law passed. If you've heard of the doctrine of managerial prerogative, that's a legal doctrine. It's from the courts. The same with that the obligation of the directors of a corporation is to maximize profits. That's also a decision from a court, from a Supreme Court case. So that the Supreme Court played an enormous role in giving these privileges and rights to corporations, essentially over the most important decisions that shape our communities. In an industrial economy, industrial society, it's the investment, production, and work decisions that shape our communities, that shape our lives. What do we do most in our life? We work. Well, somebody else is determining what work that we do. And who is it? It's the corporations. Somebody else has determined where this huge investment money is going, and a lot of it is our money. Take, for example, the utility corporations, ratepayer money that they're investing. It's our money. We've got to fight like crazy just to even get in the same room, to throw in our 2 cents about whether it should go into nuclear power or solar or whatever. They act as if it's their money. It's our money. So this whole business of the market has been declared ultra vires the sovereign people. Now, this started off with this subordinate entity called the corporation. And over the course of 50 years, it's telling us we've got no authority over the decisions that count the most, that define our communities, that define our culture, that shape how we think. They also define the values and the principles in this whole question of economic growth, that we're going to have freedom and liberty through abundance. And we're going to achieve that by a constantly expanding economy, which means we've got to keep growing. So a corporation growing 12% a year, which is low these days, every 8 years they're going to double. Now corporations also, one of the things that they also changed, instead of getting their charters for 10 or 20 or 30 years for a fixed period of time, just as James I did for the East India Company in 1605, the state of New Jersey started a trend in 1898 to charter corporations in perpetuity, forever. So there's another right, privilege they have beyond, we're a sovereign people, but we die. Corporation is our artificial entity, but it lives forever. The same thing, they got charters for any lawful purpose. If you go look at a charter now, the company's chartered for any lawful purpose. No limits on what it can do. It could be, so it initially goes into business making widgets, but 4 years later it's running hospitals or running a university. You can see this distinction historically in the difference between the populists and the progressives. The populist people who rose up, starting with the Grange movement and the Greenbackers in the 1870s and 1880s and early 1890s, they understood that a corporate counter-revolution was going on. The farmers and the workers, intellectuals at that time. And they organized to stop it. So if you go back and look at the platforms of their political parties and look back at all their educational stuff, they were not talking about regulating corporations around the margins, about curbing their excesses. They were saying, this is inappropriate for a free people, for a self-governing people. We cannot have the corporations having this so much power in defining our lives. And so they were talking about ownership and control. They were talking about defining the corporation. Well, they didn't win, the populists. Well, what was the next so-called era that historians have named for us? It's the progressive era. I think one of the most misnamed eras in our history, the first 2 decades of the 20th century. What the progressives did was they conceded to that the corporation would be the dominant institution of our era, that it was inevitable, irreversible. It would be the institution to define growth and progress and our values. And the best that we could do was regulate it around the margins, curb its excesses, try to perfect the market. They no longer questioned the nature or said that they could challenge the nature of the corporation. They said, we're going to rely upon shaping its behavior. Whereas the populists were very clear. They knew what the nature was, and they were going to define it or not let it exist at all. So this distinction between defining the corporation and regulating the corporation is very important for me. A sovereign people define the robots it creates. Consumers try to regulate it. And I think, by 1905, the end of the first great merger movement, we end up with like the U.S. Steel Corporation being created out of 100 or so different other corporations and these other great conglomerates. By the time 1905 came around, essentially corporations had transformed the law, they had transformed bedrock legal doctrines, they had become the sovereign people, and they had made us consumers. And then we're into the rest of the 20th century. Most of the citizen organizing and action of this century has been in that regulatory realm, has been about trying to affect the behavior of corporations. It has conceded to the corporations this enormous privilege and power and right under law, as if it has come from God or come from Mother Nature. And we have spent enormous energy and effort in the regulatory agencies trying to shape one behavior at a time, usually after the fact, after the harm has been done, and over and over and over again. Denying to ourselves that a pattern of destruction, a pattern of assault upon our sovereign nature, a pattern of assault upon our elections, upon our lawmaking, upon our educational systems, upon our culture, upon our values, is just an aberration. We can fix the behavior. And not coming to the conclusion that there's something about the nature of this entity that we have to come to grips with, as the founders came to grips with in their flawed way. They tried to put a stake through the heart of the corporation at the time of the revolution. But because, in a sense, the stakeholders were such a minority, because they had defined most of the people not as people, it's logical and natural that the robot corporation came back and redefined itself, and in the process redefined us as consumers or workers or taxpayers or whatever demeaning concept, while they're the sovereign. I don't have time to really go through all the rest of the history of the 20th century, but essentially it's been more of the same. The courts have given corporations more and more authority under the Bill of Rights. Fourth Amendment protections, protections against unreasonable search and seizure, and other Bill of Rights protections, and more free speech, creating the negative free speech doctrine and commercial free speech doctrine. So now when a community or a state tries to limit the ability of corporations to make campaign contributions, the American Civil Liberties Union gets up and defends their right to free speech. And the corporations can sit back and let the ACLU do it. And you have this initiative that passed in Maine, got 57% of the vote, this campaign reform initiative, which does not even address the distinction between a natural person and a corporation. Doesn't begin to address the legal Supreme Court doctrine that speech is a form of, that money is a form of speech, which is what it is, which means that property is a form of speech. That measure one, it doesn't address the fundamental question, and now there are people and organizations and philanthropic groups that are taking it out as the model for all the people in every state to go on, to put on their ballot. And you go and you fight and you win that, and what do you win? Nothing. Because it doesn't raise the question of the difference between a person and a corporation. It doesn't challenge the concept that property has human rights, which is what the Supreme Court did over the period of 40 years when it took the 14th Amendment, enacted to protect the rights of freed slaves, and applied it to protect property, essentially investing property with human rights, the rights of natural persons like us. And now we have corporations again rampant around the globe. And people are rising up and organizing to resist all around the globe. And we have the GATT and the World Trade Organization. I think that people in different countries need to develop their own stories, because what's happening in each country is different, and the solutions are going to have to be different. Because what the GATT and the World Trade Organization are doing is essentially, in most of the other countries of the world, recapitulating what they did in this country 100 years ago. That it was 100 years ago in this country that corporations took legal rights away from us and gave it to themselves, under law, protected by the Constitution. And now they're trying to use the World Trade Organization and the GATT to say that the people of India have no authority to define the rules of industry, commerce, investment in their countries. That GATT makes it all the same. Free trade. But what free trade is really about is that the corporations make the rules, and that the people of Malaysia, India have no authority. That commerce is ultra vires the people of India. That investment is ultra vires the people of Malaysia. They're just people. These are corporations. They have the right to define the rules, to define the culture, to define the principles, to say it's growth that's going to be it. They're going to define efficiency. They're going to define productivity. That's what's happening. But in this country, we have a separate problem. We lost it 100 years ago. So how do we begin to think of ourselves, to relearn, or to learn for the first time, what it means to act like sovereign people? Right? How do we begin to find different political arenas that really are about authority, that don't concede to the corporation enormous rights and powers under law, that don't concede that the corporation will be the dominant institution of our era, the dominant institution of our culture, will define our culture, define work, define efficiency, define productivity, define our educational system. Make the decisions about what kind of energy we'll have, how we'll use resources. Make all the relational decisions about what's public and what's private. That's why it's so incredibly logical that coming down the pike is the corporatization of Social Security. Right? You've heard about that. They want to, they want to take the Social Security Trust Fund, people's retirements, and invest it in stocks in the stock market. So they'll get a higher rate of return and live happier ever after. There's two privatizations going on there, corporatizations. One is of the money. That's bad enough, our money. But the second thing, just as bad, is the decision making. Social Security is a public entity. It's a public process. It's a process of the sovereign people. It's ours. It's constitutionalized. We have standing. You're going to take that and put it into the stock market, investing in corporations. And then, in fact, it will be true that what's good for General Motors is the only choice that we have for the rest of us. And the whole effort, energy of the country will be to maximize returns for these corporations, because everything will be on its way to being corporatized, both the tangible property and the intangible decision making. It's sometimes said that fish discover water last. And I think that applies to us. We've been colonized. We're a colonized people. We live in a corporate culture. We live in a corporate culture for the last 100 years. We're surrounded by the icons and images and propaganda and how many hundreds of billions of dollars of constant advertising. It's affected our ability to think. We censor ourselves all the time. We censor our goals. We censor our tactics and strategies. We don't demand what we know we want and what we need. And that's what we need to begin changing. What we're suggesting is that as we begin to think about ourselves, as we begin to redefine ourselves, not as consumers anymore, but as the sovereign people, then we can begin to define the corporation, to define all the subordinate entities that we create. And that's what we need to start doing. So we've made a decision for our people that we're working with, we're not going to be playing in the regulatory administrative law arenas anymore, except to disrupt or challenge the legitimacy of those arenas. And we need to move to arenas that are about authority. A couple of those arenas might be, one is to begin trying to use the quo warranto. It's still on the books in most states. In fact, we're involved now in a case in Pennsylvania. We're attempting that with the Waste Management Corporation. We're also looking at the state corporation codes. You need to look at your history and what exists here in Colorado and what your current corporation code is saying. But, you know, for example, we're working with people up in Maine. Maine is a paper company state. 7 paper companies own literally 2/3 of the land of Maine, and they control the politics of the society. So that people are looking at the possibility of an initiative that says, no corporation shall do business in the state of Maine if it produces dioxin or employs scab labor. We're not going to amend the environmental code, not going to amend the health code, not going to amend the labor code, but the corporation code. Now that's the arena of the sovereign people. And the corporate lawyers will understand immediately what is it we're doing. Now there happens to be an amendment to the state constitution from the early first decade of the century that says, no matter how chartered, corporations in Maine shall forever be answerable to the people of Maine. Now, it either means that or it doesn't mean that. You can go back to constitutional amendments that people organized to put into their state constitutions in the 1870s and 1880s that say the same kind of thing, that have since been removed. That people, generations ago, people understood that if they wanted to stick, they've got to go into the arenas of sovereignty, into constitutional arenas. And they've got to deal with the nature of the corporation, not its behavior. They've got to define the nature, or else the corporation is going to define us. And I want to give you some enthusiasm or some hope. I want to read you some excerpts from a couple of court decisions from the late 19th century. In the last 15 years of the 19th century, there's some revocations of the charters of major corporations for assault upon the sovereign people. And I want you to think about what it must have meant in the culture for the Supreme Courts of New York, Nebraska, Georgia, other states, to come up with language like this, revoking the charters of corporation. That, you know, how much it must have been invested in the culture that the law reflected this. This is in Georgia, a railroad company case. All experience has shown that large accumulations of property in hands likely to keep it intact for a long period of time are dangerous to the public weal. Having perpetual succession, any kind of corporation has peculiar faculties for such accumulation, and most governments have found it necessary to exercise great caution in the grants of corporate charters. Even religious corporations, professing, and in the main truly, nothing but the general good, have proven obnoxious to this objection, so that in England it was long ago found necessary to restrict them in their powers of acquiring real estate. Freed, as such bodies are, from the sure bounds to the schemes of individuals, the grave, they are able to add field to field and power to power until they become entirely too strong for that society which is made up of those whose plans are limited by a single life. Here's a case, a Nebraska case. Indeed, it is doubtful if free government can long exist in a country where such enormous amounts of money are accumulated in the vaults of corporations to be used at discretion in controlling the property and business of the country against the interest of the public and that of the people for the personal gain and aggrandizement of a few individuals. New York, 1890, North River Sugar Company case. Corporations, well, the life of a corporation is less than that of the humblest citizen. I'm going to read that again. The life of a corporation is less than that of the humblest citizen. This is the highest court of the state of New York, Court of Appeals of the state of New York, saying this in 1890. Corporations may and often do exceed their authority only where private rights are affected. When these are adjusted, all mischief ends and all harm is averted. But where the transgression has a wider scope and threatens the welfare of the people may summon the offender to answer for the abuse of its franchise and the violation of its corporate duty. The state permits in many ways an aggregation of capital, but mindful of the possible dangers to the people, overbalancing the benefits, the state keeps upon it a restraining hand and maintains upon it, over it, prudent supervision. And so we have reached our conclusion, and it appears to us to have been established that the defendant corporation has violated its charter and failed in the performance of its corporate duty, and that in respect so material and so important as to justify a decision of dissolution, unanimous. The dozens and dozens of such cases, and we can even come into this century, our own, the recent days. In 1976, 3 justices dissenting in the first case in 1976 that started to expand these free speech rights of corporations, saying, this is Justices White, Brennan, and Marshall in 1976. It has long been recognized that the special status of corporations has placed them in a position to control vast amounts of economic power, which, if not regulated, dominate not only the economy, but also the very heart of our democracy, the electoral process. The state need not permit its own creation to consume it. And even Chief Justice Rehnquist, dissenting in the same case, saying the blessing of potentially perpetual life and limited liability, so beneficial in the economic sphere, pose special dangers in the political sphere. All right? Special dangers to the sovereignty, to our sovereignty, to our ability to govern ourselves. So it's not immediately self-evident what it is everybody can be doing. But I think we need to begin to think of ourselves as the sovereign people. We need to learn something about the nature and the history of the corporations, how previous generations understood what they were, how corporations took the power and the rights under law from us, how what we are seeing now, whether it's in the destruction of the forest or massive pollution or electing our public officials for us or writing our laws, these are symptoms. These are manifestations of the power that the corporations took a long time ago, wiping out, and the fact that the history has been rewritten, that we live in a corporate culture with a fish, we don't necessarily understand what's going on. I think I'll take a couple of lines from Lawrence Goodwin, who wrote a wonderful book on the history of the populist movement, talking about the great attempt, the great achievement of the populists. These populists, these farmers and workers, were intimidated people creating for themselves the psychological space to dare to aspire grandly and dare to be autonomous in the presence of powerful new institutions of economic concentration and cultural regimentation, to work together to be free individually. There was a crucial democratic insight in which they tried to surmount rigid cultural inheritances and to act with autonomy and self-confidence. They were individual people who needed the psychological support of other people to see themselves experimenting in democratic forms. Not experimenting in how to be better consumers, but how to really aspire to the kind of democracy that in our hearts we know we want. I'm going to close with two examples of things. In 1644, if I have it. In 1664, the king who had chartered the Massachusetts Bay Company in Massachusetts sent some commissioners of his to investigate whether the governors of this corporation were staying within their authority. The governors of the corporation objected, saying it was an infringement upon their rights. The commissioners, speaking for the king, said the following: "The king did not grant away his sovereignty over you when he made you a corporation. When His Majesty gave you power to make wholesome laws and to administer justice by them, He parted not with His right of judging whether justice was administered accordingly or not. When His Majesty gave you authority over such subjects as live within your jurisdiction, He made them not your subjects, nor you their supreme authority." 230 years later, your president and mine sent a letter to the mayor of Toledo, Ohio. This is on January 10th of this year. The Chrysler Corporation had announced it's closing its Jeep manufacturing plant in Toledo. It's a 50, 60-year-old factory. And the mayor had written to the president to ask for help in getting Chrysler Corporation to invest in its new plant within the boundaries of Toledo, get the jobs and the taxes. The president wrote back, "As I am sure you know, my administration cannot endorse any potential location for the new production site. My intergovernmental affairs staff will be happy to work with you once the Chrysler Board of Directors has made its decision." The leader of the most powerful country in the world, the leader of the sovereign people fabled in story and song, says, we all stand out there with our hat in hand waiting for the board of directors of the Chrysler Corporation to make its decision. So I'll close by suggesting to you that sovereign people do not wait outside the boardrooms of corporations, of subordinate entities, of the robots that we created. We don't negotiate with subordinate entities. Corporations cannot be socially responsible. We're the ones who have to be socially responsible. And we have to be accountable to one another and to the earth and to our forebears and to our posterity by asserting our authority over all the institutions we create, business or government. We're not being socially accountable or civically accountable when we play by corporate rules in corporate arenas. We're not being socially responsible or civically accountable when we don't act like sovereign people. We're not being socially responsible or civically accountable when we permit our elected officials to bargain away our sovereignty. We're not being socially responsible or civically accountable when we in our organizations go to corporate executives and to the hacks who run the corporate front groups and ask them, please, please cause a little less harm. Sovereign people define the entities we create. Sovereign people instruct subordinate entities. And when a subordinate entity assaults our sovereignty, when it undermines the basic mechanisms of a self-governing people, our elections, our lawmaking, our schools, our judiciary, we move in swiftly and accountably to cut this cancer out of the body politic so that we can govern ourselves with the dignity commensurate to being human, and sovereign human at that. In this way, we honor the millions of people who struggled before us to wrest power from tyrants, to define themselves in the face of the terror and violence. And we make all the struggles for justice and democracy easier by weakening the ability of corporations to make the rules. It's not possible because Corporations are too strong because we won't have jobs, we won't have toilet paper, food, health care, because we can't run our towns and our communities without these global corporations, because the corporations will run away, take our jobs and take the money, because philanthropic corporations won't give us money to our groups, because it's scary, because we don't know how to act like the sovereign people, because it's not realistic here in 1997 for people across the nation to mobilize to take away the civil and political rights of these artificial entities that we created. But it is realistic to keep fighting corporation after corporation, one harm at a time, by their rules, over and over and over and over again. That's realistic. It's realistic to let them take away our free speech and our assembly, our clean air, our clean water, our food, our health care, our education, our elections, our legislators. That's realistic. Our president may not know it, but we the people did not grant away our sovereignty when we made Chrysler into a corporation. When we gave the Chrysler Corporation authority to manufacture automobiles, we made the people of Toledo not its subjects, nor Chrysler Corporation their supreme authority. How long shall we the people, we the sovereign people, stand hat in hand outside corporate boardrooms waiting to be told our fates, waiting to be told how to think? How long until we instruct our representatives to do their constitutional duty? How long until we become responsible, until we become accountable to our forebears, to ourselves, to other people and other species, and to the earth? Thank you.
I missed out learning about the history of corporations, which I'm embarrassed about. When I got into college, I got into environmental science as my major. And the two courses that I had the hardest time with were environmental economics and environmental law. I couldn't seem to understand what it was they were trying to teach us, and something felt like it stank to me, and I couldn't put my finger on it. And you helped me put my finger on it tonight. And what I'd like to know is, in the 20-some years that it's been since I've been in those courses, have they changed, and are they now teaching this?
Not to my knowledge. And I must say, until we started looking at this stuff 5 or 6 years ago, I had no idea of this either. But there's an enormous literature on it once you find it. It's like a funnel. It took a while, but it's like a funnel. Once we got in every generation, there were people who talked like this, who organized like this, and they left an incredible legacy of pamphlets, books, law review articles. I mean, there are even people within the legal community. These are not issues of debate within the legal community now. These are not what lawyers and law professors write law review articles about, for the most, hardly any. And so, in fact, as we move into this case in Pennsylvania, where at this point, we've asked the Attorney General of Pennsylvania to begin revocation proceedings against the certificate to do business in Pennsylvania of the Waste Management Company. He declined politely, saying he has discretion. So we're now in the courts asking that the courts order the Attorney General to begin this proceeding. We're always in danger of being sort of laughed out as frivolous, as the attorneys for waste management called us, because there's no current literature on this. On the other hand, the literature that exists is enormous. And as the citations from Rehnquist and Justice Marshall and Brennan in the modern times indicate, that even within the relatively contemporary literature, you still see reflection of this stuff. But for example, when wonderful people go to law school to study labor law, they want to be labor lawyers and environmental lawyers, two wonderful professions and wonderful aspirations. What happens is, for the most part, unless they go to a very unique place or find a very unique teacher, they mostly study regulatory administrative law. That's what they know. When they come out, then when clients go to them and say, well, I know how to go to the EPA or the NLRB, I've studied that, and I've studied the 6 billion pages of the Code of Federal Regulations. They don't study legal history, they don't study constitutional law, I doubt if they go back and read the history of the East India Company. And they're right in there being realistic, dealing with the behavior of corporation and not talking about the nature. Sir?
Well, how does the court know when the sovereign people are speaking? You know what I mean?
Yes.
In other words, we're not all there in the courtroom, and I mean, how do they? Yeah.
It's a vital question, and that's why something that it helps make clear that what at least we're talking about, we don't consider what we're doing as basically a legal strategy. That the culture has to change, and just as during the civil rights movement, even in the Deep South, when you had African Americans were brought before the bar of justice, so-called in Alabama, Mississippi, you had a movement. And so you had the courtroom filled and the plaza was filled, and it was a cultural and social movement as well as a political movement. And so the people were speaking through their organizing, and they were changing the culture. The courts will follow once the culture starts to change. To the extent that the people of Pennsylvania start to mobilize and talk about what's happening at all the waste management dumps and all that, maybe the courts will pay attention, but I have no particular hope in this instance because that organizing is not taking place, and this is still so very new. Over here.
I've heard that philanthropic organizations dispense more money than the total discretionary money that the U.S. government has to disperse each year. Now, these organizations also have an infinite lifetime, and I've in years past heard some legislators express concerns about the fact that they would lose control because of that. I wonder if you'd comment on that.
I don't know about the numbers that you gave, about the amount of money. Philanthropic corporations are one kind of corporation, and they pretty much, the large ones especially, have an enormous impact on shaping how we think and shaping ideas. And there is virtually no we don't exercise much authority over them. So, like any other entity that we create, what should be the proper relationship between a philanthropic corporation and the society as a whole? That's up to us to determine. So I don't have a very specific answer to your question, but it's no different from any other corporation. It shouldn't be writing its own rules, or doing what it wants, particularly if what it's doing is considered harmful to the body politic in some way.
Well, there was a suggestion that they have finite lifetimes. I wonder if you can impose a rule that corporations also have a finite life.
Well, it once was the case. And I don't see why we can't. That's a political decision. So that's up to us, isn't it? I'm sure that they'll find, the creative lawyers will find all kinds of doctrines and all kinds of arguments why we can't. But we have to expect that. Yeah?
I don't understand why a statewide strategy would be viable, because suppose this strategy wins, and I don't understand the end game strategy, because if you win, say, in 49 states, they all move, let's say, to Delaware, the 50th.
Well,
if you finally win in all 50 states, then they're going to migrate abroad.
Another very good question. We at least are not attempting to go state by state to revoke charters, or even to try to revoke a lot of charters. What's happening in Pennsylvania is and sort of educating and organizing experience. Because the issues that have to come forward is, whose property is this? What happens after a revocation? And to what extent can states, as states tried to do over 100 years ago, to what extent can states make the rules of commerce and corporate behavior inside their borders? Suppose the people of Pennsylvania, amended their state corporation code or put in their constitution, say no corporation can do business in Pennsylvania unless ABC, or if they do XYZ. There's two things there. One is that some corporations will want the Pennsylvania market, and they'll want to be in Pennsylvania. They'll want to do business. They'll want to do business there, and they'll abide by the rules that are in the corporation code or in the Constitution.
They don't have to be chartered in Pennsylvania to operate in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, they have to get a certificate of authority to operate in Pennsylvania, and that operates just like a charter. Waste management is chartered in Delaware. In order to do business in Pennsylvania, it has to get from the Secretary of State a certificate of authority, and that's governed just like a charter historically and all that. So what what we're trying to do now is to get the state to revoke the certificate of authority to do business in Pennsylvania. So it puts really square on the forefront the question of property. Whose property is it? Can a corporation pick up and take its assets, what it calls its assets, after using the air and the water and the labor of people, you know, pick up and leave? There is, I mean, Washington State, for example, now in its current corporation code, is if the directors of a corporation are convicted of conspiracy, all the corporate property is forfeited to the state. I mean, there's certainly precedent for that. It becomes a question of power. We have to say, you know, we're the people and here are the rules. And also, in the process, we need to start provoking a debate on property. This is not an easy subject in the United States of America. One of the things I didn't mention that in this process from the 1870s to 1920, during the transformation of the law, the corporations cloaked themselves in the language of freedom and sovereignty, the language of individual democracy and liberty, that maximum liberty would come from private property, from maximum private property, not from some sense of the commons or shared property and all that. And we have, you know, incredible legacy. This is America. The Constitution is a property-protecting document. This is a private property country. We have all this mythology and stuff about private property. I think there's a difference between, a very important difference between the private property of individual people and the property of a corporation. And there's a lot of doctrines or theories that people are trying to work out. There's a law professor at Harvard who's creating something called the reliance interest in property, that after a while the workers working at a factory actually have a property interest, what he calls a reliance interest in the property. They have a stake. And occasionally this comes up in some lower courts where some judges actually accept the idea that workers or a community, it's not just their good neighbors, that they actually have a property right in the corporate property. So what happens, you know, people ask, well, what happens if there's a revocation? What happens to the next? That's very much a political decision. I mean, it really depends on what kind of movement there is, how people are organized, and whether there's been a debate to raise these questions about private and public, both in terms of decision making and in terms of tangible property. It's been said by one constitutional scholar that during that period of time of the transformation of the law, when there was something that the federal courts wanted to protect, to give the protection of the Constitution, they declared it property, such as the right to future profits was declared property, protected by the Constitution, given due process, equal protection. The right to work applied to a corporation was the right to work of an individual. I mean, in the language of the decision, they talk about a person. Well, corporations were persons by then. And the judges know exactly what they were doing. But the language was, you have a right to a job and to the tools of your job and to have that job as a person. But the case was about a corporation. So they couched it, camouflaged it in a sense, in the rights of a person. The right of a corporation to invest its money and do what it's doing. Sir?
The little I know about corporations is that they only function with people. And I'm having a hard time separating that corporation that functions with people from people that make up the sovereignty. And some of my best friends work for corporations. And I kind of like them, but I like, you know, peace and environment and all of that. Where does that line come from?
Well, as individuals, as natural persons, you know, they certainly should have all the rights of any natural person. If there's something about the nature of the corporation that transforms who they are, I mean, when they're making collective decisions.
So when they walk through the door, they grow horns, or?
No, they're probably still nice people, but I mean, what's the purpose of a corporation? What's the principal purposes of a corporation? It's a shield. It's a shield from liability. I thought it provides jobs so people we can get, you know, there are a lot of places to create jobs. I mean, there's many different ways to create jobs. You don't have to have a corporate form in order to have work and jobs. But legally, I mean, why do people incorporate? You know, why is General Electric a corporation? One of the principal reasons is the corporation is a legal shield. That for the most part, it's very hard. It happens occasionally, but for the most part, the individual humans making the decisions, A, are hard to find, you know, and B, they're protected. They don't have that kind of responsibility, you know. I mean, most of the Fortune, I don't say most, many, maybe most, but I can't document it, but many of the Fortune 500 corporations are convicted felons. You know, they pay the fine or fix whatever they allegedly harm, and they go on to the next thing. The men and women making the decisions, nothing happens to them. In fact, they're still there, and they go on to do more things. So there's something about the structure, the institution, and its role. Now, part of me would settle in the nearest term to leave some of that in place. I mean, they say that you need limitations on liability protections in order to attract capital. I think the situation has changed between now and 100 years ago about attracting capital and all that. But well, I just lost my train of thought on that.
Liability of the...
Yeah, that to leave some of that structure in place, thank you. But to take away the civil and political rights. I mean, should a corporation as an entity have free speech? I mean, should Mobile Corporation, should we allow Mobile Corporation to take out these ads in the New York Times to instruct us on what it's like to be in a democracy? Should we let the Archer Daniels Midland Corporation instruct us through their massive propaganda on how to do environmentally sound agriculture? You know, I mean, should we allow these corporations, by giving money to think tanks and writing studies and influencing the public debate, shaping our culture, you know?
So are you saying they shouldn't have a voice?
As a corporation, no. If the employees want to come on their own time, just like you and me. I mean, how many hearings of people who go to environmental hearings? How many times have you taken a day off from work or gone to a hearing and you go there and there are 5 corporate people who are getting paid for the day? They don't care if they have to sit around all day in the halls. They're getting paid. That's their job. You know, that's inappropriate. Giving money to think tanks to write reports that reflect their thought. I mean, I don't see a role. If we're really a self-governing people, and this is really a democracy, why should this artificial entity be shaping the way we think? You know, I mean, this notion of PepsiCo and Nike and Coke, you know, signing contracts with schools and universities to make their products the exclusive product and promising to quell dissent, you know, that if students say bad things about the product, that the principal will discipline them. It's in the contract. You know, why are we doing that?
You can't scold Nike here.
Well, your point confuses me a little bit because the corporations are owned. I mean, for example, let's just take PepsiCo. I would be willing to bet you that a fair number of the teachers' pension funds own stock in PepsiCo.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well, I think that
in terms of control and authority.
I think there's an opportunity there for the shareholders to exercise a certain amount of influence on the corporation, and the corporation needs capital to survive. And I don't agree with you when you say that they just ignore these events that are negative to the corporation, because in fact capital will move out of a corporation, and it's pretty immediate, which is, in my opinion, one of the problems we have in our economy, because long-term investment strategy to a lot of people is like 4 days. You know, I'm in the stock for 4 days, I'm out of the stock in a few days later. So there is an opportunity to influence the corporation, and I think there definitely needs to, the other piece of the puzzle is, it is tremendously expensive and time-consuming in our society today to take any legal action against a corporation. They just put you in, you know, getting into the federal court system, you might get a hearing in 5 years in some states or some jurisdictions. And so, I mean, that's an area that needs definite reform. But one other point on ownership, and that would be, it's not inconceivable if done right, investing Social Security funds in corporations would be a way to actually exercise even more power and authority within the community, because it's done with money. It's not. I just don't see political will there.
Well, again, some very important questions, points, and the kind of things that I would encourage us all to be talking about, because it's not, the answers aren't self-evident. I'll just say 2 things. That this basically over the last 25 and 30 years, that decisions of courts, primarily coming out of Delaware, Delaware is the big corporate, most of the Fortune 500 companies are chartered in Delaware because the whole structure of the state and the courts are corporate in the rights of stockholders. It's been very significant to affect any real change. Now these pension funds that you mentioned, because of the other laws that corporations help to pass, the unions, teachers union, whatever, that has a pension fund, they have very little authority over it. I mean, it's basically in the hands of bank managers, other corporations who are doing it. I mean, so you have, you know, like electricians union pension fund being used to invest in construction of a new building that hires non-union electrical workers, and they don't have any authority over it. So that it comes back to the question of what are the levers of authority. Now, if in fact there was a connection between ownership and control, and that all the little shareholders could somehow get together, that might begin to make a difference. But we have, you know, there are a lot of church organizations and people that buy a couple of shares and then try to influence a shareholder resolution and all that. And it seems like, to me, like an enormous investment in time and energy, running into the barriers of the regulatory agencies just like anywhere else. So there clearly needs to be a shareholder revolt of some kind. And that, you know, we have this notion, we're told, well, the shareholders own it's really another form of democracy. The shareholders, the board of directors is responsible to the shareholders, and the shareholders call the shots. Well, I'd like you to try this. If you have a couple of shares of stock of the General Motors Corporation, I'd like you to go up there and knock on the gates and say, hi, I'm one of the owners. I'd like to see the property and I'd like to see the books. Well, it's going to be hard. In terms of Social Security, it worries me very much. Some of my friends tell me that have said the same thing, that once we get a foothold in there, we'll be able to set some criteria for a socially responsible corporation or a good corporation. Scares me to death. Scares me to death. But you know, I'm willing to talk about it. Sir.
More than 100 years ago, Finley Peter Dunn said the Supreme Court reads the election returns. Have there been some recent decisions that you think were motivated by election returns?
I would agree with what he said. I think the courts are...
Thinking about examples recently, because I know...
Well, I think the Supreme Court has responded on abortion over the last, since Roe versus Wade. I think it's that it has a sense of where the majority of the people are on that. I think we've got to sort of take away the mystique that the Supreme Court has been given and treat them like any other political entity. You know, when the NAC, in 1937, the NAACP commissioned a report by some constitutional lawyer to look in. They wanted to start going after the separate but equal doctrine, which is from 1898, Plessis versus Ferguson, that said that segregation is okay as long as the facilities are equal. And up, you know, through those first 3 decades of the 20th century, a lot of black lawyers and white lawyers were going around trying at least to get some equality. And then there was a, you know, it was like they were saying, we're going to try to change the behavior a little bit. And then there was a transformation within the strategizing, the thinking of the African-American lawyers, and said, separate but equal is no good. We want to end segregation, which means they had to go get a reversal of the Plessy versus Ferguson doctrine. And in 1937, when they sort of sat down to first formulate this, there were many people that said, you can't do that. You know, this has been the settled doctrine for almost 40 years. You know, the history is already gone. I mean, it's like it's forever. It's 2 generations away. You'll never change it. How are you going to persuade? They're obviously all going to be white judges. How are you going to persuade them to change it? You know, and they set upon a strategy, 37, 47, 51. Was it? So that's 52. 15 years, 16 years. I mean, it took a while, but they figured out ways to do it. And they got a unanimous court. Now, that changed also very little. That you needed a movement, the civil rights movement, to actually bring about the changes. You know, and then subsequently the courts, as the movement gained steam, and as, you know, the notion of equal rights and rights for African Americans, you know, got more and more implanted throughout the culture. The courts responded. It's extraordinary to read essays and decisions and books of learned jurists in the first couple of decades of this century, the most respected jurists of the time, with the horrendous racist language that they used automatically. It took the culture to take that out. Not totally. I mean, we can see all kinds of examples around us today, too. It's extraordinary to see how quickly, I mean, over the course of a half century, say, what was the respected position disappears and is replaced by something that would have seemed totally crazy sometime before. Yes?
Richard, somebody said something about the corporations moving overseas, which is obvious, you know, that if the environment is unfriendly, they will just move offshore. What do you see as a long-term vision for this movement if in this country we were to succeed, which, you know, is hard to conceive of, but, you know, it's possible. But then what would happen in the global situation? Can you...
Well, I mean, I think one of our tasks here is to help get the global corporations chartered in our names in this country off the backs of the rest of the country. I mean, people are struggling in other countries to stop what's going on and to sort of get back or get control. And I think that, as my friends in Malaysia and India tell me all the time, the best thing you all can do in the United States is to get, you know, rein in your corporations, get their power away from them, so that we can deal with what's here and not with your corporations rampaging the world. Now, Coca-Cola, I mean, the companies that are truly global and have assets in all countries of the world, you know, even to the extent that we can do something about them here, including their assets here, whatever that might be, you know, probably won't affect their assets in India or Malaysia, whatever. But at least we can rein in their political power. I mean, their political power backed by economic power, which gets them, enables them to use the power of the United States government to blackmail, to threaten, to do all the things it does on behalf of these corporations. I mean, you had, for example, a couple of years ago, well, I don't remember all the details, but the Gerber Corporation in Nicaragua or in Honduras, there was a movement afoot in that country to get them to do something. And they went right to the U.S. government and had something on them, and, you know, to get them to intervene in this world body on their behalf, which they did. And that's happening all the time. If we don't know it's happening, we know it's happening. So, I mean, what does it mean when you have these entities that are also still chips off the block of sovereignty, that they are being empowered by the U.S. Constitution and therefore the law of the land? And, you know, it's like a corporation can use the state officials, the state police, and the militia to keep its workers in line. If there's a strike, you know, who's there? You know, it's the National Guard or the state police. Yes?
I'm very curious, when you were in Canada, what were the Canadians saying about corporations in the United States?
Well, at the conference that I was at, which was at the University of British Columbia Law School, people seemed, and I can't say if this is true all over Canada, and because this is British Columbia, where the resource corporations are basically doing what the East India Company did in India. I mean, they're just vacuuming out the resources in British Columbia. That they are very clear that both Canadian and American and Japanese and German and other corporations are in there basically doing whatever they want, and that they run the British Columbia government. They seem to run the British Columbia courts. And some people were responding to the idea that we need to look at the nature of the corporation and define the arenas of sovereignty rather than just going after their trying to change their behavior. And they brought up a good parallel. In the early 1980s, Canadians finally got a written Bill of Rights. It's called the Canadian Charter of Rights and Responsibilities. And it's broadly equivalent to our Bill of Rights. Well, what's happening, and there's a case now appearing right now, is that the entities that began to use this first and foremost were the corporations. That they immediately moved to try to get Bill of Rights protections for the commercial entities. Just what the American corporations did with the 14th Amendment, to try to get it applied to property. So they understand very clearly that if they can get the Canadian Charter of Rights and Responsibilities defined over the next couple of decades by the courts, as applying to commercial ventures, to corporations, that will limit the ability of the provincial and federal government of Canada to write the rules. So, I mean, they know, I suspect that the Canadian lawyers understand the history of what happened here in the latter part of the 19th century very, very clearly, and they're trying to do the same thing. And so the Canadians are very concerned about that. Yes, sir.
If I understand you correctly, you're seeing this as a perceptual revolution first, that we have to really understand that we're the sovereign people in order to be able to act like the sovereign people.
Yes.
If you were to suggest 2 or 3 don't mourn, organize type suggestions as to how we could do that, what are the suggestions do you think?
Well, one is I think people need to start coming together and talking about this stuff. And what has sort of been working for us is to start doing some historical looking at the corporate histories in our own states. The states historically and currently are the jurisdiction of the corporation in the United States. And more so in the earlier states, less so in the western states, but still, you have an enormous literature which is untouched as far as we've been able to discover of how previous generations dealt with this, the kinds of authority you once had. Now, for example, in Wisconsin, up to the 1920s, no corporation can own another corporation. There were limitations on property size. There were limitations on capital. It was a felony to give money to political campaigns. It was the law. So when we started to go to Wisconsin and bring people together, and we said, well, what are some of your dream goals? And they put them up and said, well, this is really preposterous, isn't it? And then we unveiled the board. And said, this is what was true in Wisconsin only 50, 60 years ago. So it's not so crazy. So I think learning something about the history and then coming together to talk about this to sort of uncolonize ourselves, because the tactics and strategies aren't all self-evident. I mean, I think, one of the things we're exploring is, trying to amend the corporation code, trying to revoke some charters to get the language. And it's really exciting for us in Pennsylvania now to be writing the briefs and thinking our strategy through in the language we've been teaching ourselves for the last 3 years, steeping ourselves in the language of those revocations and throwing it back into the courts. So for one example is, right away in the court proceeding, in the part where we're asking the courts to order the Attorney General to begin the revocation proceeding, which is where we're at now, the Waste Management Company petitioned to intervene, logically enough from their standpoint, saying that they have a stake in this process. And we figured out, well, we would respond, how would sovereign people respond to that? Well, we responded very succinctly. This is a matter between the sovereign people and our agents in government, in which this subordinate entity called the Waste Management Corporation has no standing. And to our surprise, in 5 minutes, the judge agreed, and he denied. Who knew? Who knew? So, and then, as we think ahead to the, if we ever get, and sooner or later we'll get to this quo warranto hearing, and we're trying to lay the seeds linguistically and thematically to say, we're not willing to concede that once it's a quo warranto, which is this, as one of the Delaware court decisions of 60 years ago said, that quo warranto is a process where for of goes back before the memory of man. I mean, it's a at least 1,000-year-old process. That in a quo warranto, we are going to not concede that the corporation has free speech and due process rights. That we're going to challenge, we're going to keep raising the fundamental challenges. So we're going to take up the court's time, and they may just call it frivolous and throw us out, but we're going to start bringing this up and says, in the hearing of the sovereign people, this is not the EPA regulatory hearing, this is not the NLRB, this is the hearing of the sovereign people. We make the rules. And in fact, when I started to think of that, then I went and got some books on the Nuremberg trial. Because what was the Nuremberg trials? After the war, the victors got together and they wanted to try the people and institutions who committed all these atrocities. And they didn't think that existing law was sufficient. So they created a unique process. And in fact, in that process, I discovered the defendants had no due process. There was no rights of appeal. Ordinary rules of evidence didn't hold. They created the rules. And in fact, the principles of the Nuremberg Treaty which encompasses the agreement about how the trials will be run, set up the standards that it is not a defense, it's not an acceptable defense that I was just doing my job, or that the organization was doing sovereign, the sovereign immunity was not a defense, that I worked for the government or I was given orders. The Nuremberg Principles removes the shield and saying that the human beings are culpable for what they did. And that is another arena of sovereignty. And it seems to me that there's some parallel there between a quo warranto, a hearing of the sovereign people, and the Nuremberg type thing where we make the rules. So those are a couple of little suggestions. How long are we going? Well, until you leave. A couple more minutes.
I've never felt so good in a long time since I heard you speak tonight. And I just want to make just a comment that if we really have to be successful about the sovereign people thing, because unless we control population and control the corporations, nature's just going to pull the rug out from under us because we're destroying our environment. So we have to be successful about this. This is very urgent. And
It's serious. I agree with that. I think people are starting to leave. There's a couple of workshops tomorrow, and be ample opportunity to talk. And I'll be here and be happy to engage with all of you. So thank you very much. On corporations, law, and democracy over the last 4 or 5 years has been bringing people together to talk about this stuff. We've been trying to have democratic conversations, listening to each other and ourselves rather than to the instruments of the dominant culture. Engaging each other, sort of asking what's going on. How do we get to this place? How do we get to this place where property, which is really what a corporation is, an agglomeration of property, has the same rights as human beings? And because it's an agglomeration of property and wealth, it is therefore more powerful than human beings. How did this happen? So we've been trying to sort of figure out our side of the story, not the corporate story, not the story of the dominant in history, but our story of how we got to this place. And we've been piecing it together. It's sort of like a tapestry. It's not necessarily chronological, and it has a lot of weavings, a lot of different strands and threads weaving in and out. And I'm going to try tonight to talk to you about our story in terms of where we are today. The fascinating thing about this process has been that as different people come in with different histories and different perspectives, the story changes. I mean, they bring in their perspective, and the whole story changes. And it makes it clearer, easier for us to see different connections. And I'm hoping to engage all of you in this story so that you will bring in your perspectives and your histories and the histories that you know into this story, so that finally, at some point, maybe in some years, we'll have a very clear, many people, a critical mass of people, will have a very clear sense of how we got to this place. And it'll be our story and not the story of the General Electric Corporation or the Westinghouse Corporation or the Bank of America Corporation. One of the hard things about developing our story is to know where to begin. You know, we can begin, it doesn't matter what the industry is, whether it's telecommunications or media or pharmaceuticals or healthcare. And so right now we have our 3 principal TV networks are owned by 2 nuclear companies and a cartoon company. So it doesn't seem to be necessarily a relationship between the company that owns the company and what each of them do. In Vermont, about a year ago, the Vermont legislature passed a law and the governor signed it, which said that any product made with recombinant BGH, the bovine growth hormone, had to be labeled. Shortly thereafter, a couple of front corporations of corporations, the Ice Cream Manufacturers Association, the Grocery Store Owners Association, the Dairy Farmers Association, front corporations of the real corporations, with the Monsanto Corporation only as a friend of the court, the manufacturer of the hormone, appealed to the courts in Vermont to declare this law unconstitutional because it was an invasion of the free speech of these corporations. There is a doctrine now called negative free speech, that a corporation can't be compelled to say things about itself that it doesn't want to say. Now the state appeals court, the state courts turned down that petition. So they went to the federal courts, and in September of 1996, a federal court 3-judge panel considered the case and decided that, yes, if this case came to the Supreme Court, it would be likely that they would declare this law unconstitutional as an invasion of the First Amendment rights of these corporations, and therefore called upon the judiciary of the state of Vermont to suspend the law until the Supreme Court, or if until the Supreme Court hears the case. At the ministers' meeting of the World Trade Organization in World War II, we can begin at the Civil War, we can begin at the American Revolution, we can begin in the 15th century, we can go back to the Greeks and the Romans. You can go back to sort of the beginning of time when people started coming together to resist, to form entities, to form governments or whatever, to resist tyranny. It all seems to be all of history has been about humans trying to tyrannize other humans and humans trying to organize to resist the tyranny of other humans. So I'm not going to go back all the way tonight. I'm going to start basically with the 15th century. A big change, a lot of big changes, I guess, happened in the 15th century. One of the big changes, well, two of the big things that happened towards the end of the century, as you know, from Western Europe, the explorers went out and started making their ways around the world. Columbus, of course, in 1492, Vasco da Gama circumnavigated the globe, I think, in 1498. There was strong central governments in Eastern Europe and in Europe, and there was interest in exploration and riches and wealth and power and tyranny. And one of the changes that took place sort of psychologically was the change in viewing business and money and well, particularly usury. That something had to happen, sort of a precursor to a commercial era. Needed to happen to remove the sanctions on charging interest on usury. I mean, it really was the cultures, law and cultures did not look kindly on charging interest, making money from money, and on centering your life on raising huge amounts of wealth. And the Puritans and the Calvinists seem to have changed. Good evening. It's good to be here. I've come recently. I was in Canada recently on my way to here, so I have a tiger story. It seems that two fellows were in the jungles of Canada, running around, and they ran into a huge tiger. Just a couple of hundred yards from where they were standing, and they both were quite scared, and they both froze. And one of them just slowly and carefully began to take off his pack, let it down, open it up, and he pulled out a pair of running shoes. And very slowly and carefully started to slip off his shoes and put on the running shoes. Meanwhile, his terrified buddy's looking at him and says, "What are you doing all that for? You're not going to be able to outrun the tiger." To which he replied, "Yes, that's true, but I'll be able to outrun you." There's probably a moral in that somewhere. In 1837, the legislature of the state of Pennsylvania declared, "A corporation in law is just what the Incorporation Act makes it. It is the creature of the law and may be molded to any shape or for any purpose that the legislature may deem most conducive for the general good." And that pretty much reflected both the law and the culture in the states at that time. But a lot of things have been happening lately, which makes one wonder how that could have been true. For example, we see lots of mergers and acquisitions, giant corporations coming together, becoming more giant corporations. In December in Singapore, one of the many subjects that was under discussion was opening up all government procurement at every level, local, municipal, state, federal, in every country around the world, to the lowest bidder of any corporation anywhere. essentially removing whatever rules that a municipality or a state has regarding the setting up criteria, conditions for letting contracts. We're talking about literally trillions of dollars. You're talking about all the government spending in the world. On last November's ballot, in a couple of states, there were some versions of campaign finance reform initiatives. One of the most prominent ones was in Maine, which essentially was a fairly limited, extremely limited bill. But it did begin to talk about restricting the contributions of corporations. There was no opposition to this initiative except from one organization, the American Civil Liberties Union, which takes the position that any infringement upon free speech is counter to the idea of the First Amendment, including corporate free speech. So I'm sure I can make a list, and you all can make a list of many examples where it appears as if corporations have certain powers and privileges and rights under law that don't seem to be consistent with common sense, and that enable them, in fact, to exert power and authority over the culture, over our democratic processes, over how we think. The program